Welcome back. I was going through a script this week. One of those stories where the protagonist never raises her voice, never sends a threatening message, never makes a single dramatic gesture. What she does instead is far more deliberate. She lets the board believe they won, and then she uses the one clause they forgot to read. That is the kind of cold precision that separates revenge from strategy. You are watching Eternal Diary. The smell of the boardroom always reminded Vivian Kael of something being sealed. Not closed. Sealed. Like a document placed in an envelope, the flap pressed down with the heel of a palm, the adhesive catching. Final, irreversible. The room smelled of the specific brand of cedar polish the cleaning crew used on the long mahogany table every Sunday night. And underneath that, the faint metallic edge of the building's old HVAC system. And underneath that, something Vivian had never been able to name. The accumulated pressure of decades of decisions made by people who believed the room itself gave them authority. She had been walking into this room for 9 years. She had signed the lease on the office space when the building was still half empty and the elevator on the east side didn't work. She had chosen the table. She had approved the painting on the far wall, a minimalist seascape in gray and muted gold that the board members' wives invariably complimented at the annual gala. She had hired every department head currently sitting around that table, with the exception of the 2 board-appointed independents who had joined in the last fiscal year. She walked in at 7:43 a.m., 17 minutes before the scheduled start of the Q3 review, and she set her portfolio on the table in front of her usual chair. Second from the head, left side, with a direct sightline to the projection screen, and she poured herself a glass of water from the carafe, and she opened her notebook to the first clean page. And she clicked her pen once. And then she noticed that her chair had been moved. Not dramatically, not obviously, just shifted 6 inches to the left, so that the gap between her position and the head of the table was wider than it should have been, a gap that placed her visually slightly further from the center of the room. It was the kind of adjustment that a stranger would never register. Vivian registered it immediately. She looked at the chair, she looked at the gap. She put the pen down on her notebook, reached over, and moved her chair back to its original position. Then, she sat down and waited. The board members filed in over the next 15 minutes. Marcus Webb, the chairman, arrived last, which was his habit. He was 61 years old, wore the same style of navy suit he had been wearing since Vivian first met him at a venture capital dinner 11 years ago, and he had the particular quality of powerful men who had spent decades in rooms like this one, a smoothness to his movements, a deliberate calibration of his expressions, the perpetual mild smile that communicated absolute confidence without disclosing anything at all. He looked at her chair when he came in. The look lasted less than half a second. Vivian watched him see that she had moved it back. She watched him make the micro-adjustment to his expression, a slight recalibration, almost imperceptible, the smile staying exactly where it was. And then he took his seat at the head of the table and opened his leather folder and said, "Good morning, everyone. Shall we begin?" It was not a question. The Q3 review lasted 2 hours and 14 minutes. Vivian presented the numbers, answered every question, corrected a projection error that the CFO, Daniel Cho, had failed to catch, and said nothing about the chair. When the formal review concluded, Marcus asked the department heads to step out for a brief executive session. Vivian knew, in the way that she had always known things about this company, the way she knew when a product launch was going to underperform before the data confirmed it, the way she knew when an employee was about to resign 3 weeks before they handed in their notice, that the executive session was the chair. She sat with her hands folded on the table and waited. Marcus began with the word Vivian, said in a tone that was almost tender, which was how she knew it was going to be thorough. He said that the board had been conducting a strategic review. He said that after extensive deliberation, a phrase he used twice, which told her the deliberation had been neither extensive nor genuine, the board had reached a consensus that Kael Group required a different kind of leadership for its next phase of growth. He said the word transformation 4 times. He mentioned the importance of fresh perspective and accelerated scaling and alignment with investor expectations. He said that Vivian's contributions to the company were, and here he paused to choose the word with the care of a man selecting a weapon, foundational. Foundational. Past tense. He said that the board had identified a replacement. Her name was Dara Voss. She was 34 years old, had spent the previous 4 years as a COO at a mid-sized fintech company in San Francisco, and had been brought to the board's attention through the investment network of Elliott Bryce, the second board-appointed independent, who had joined 14 months ago and whom Vivian had, from the beginning, disliked with a precision that she now understood had been entirely warranted. Daniel Cho, sitting 2 seats to Marcus's right, did not look at Vivian once during the entire speech. This was the detail that stayed with her afterward. Not the betrayal itself. She had understood betrayal academically since she was 27, since her first business partner had taken the client list and the operating capital and disappeared into a new LLC registered in Delaware. And she had learned then that the anticipation of betrayal was simply the cost of building anything worth stealing. She had not been surprised by the board's decision. She had been watching the architecture of it being assembled for months, had seen the pieces being moved into position. The new governance committee that Marcus had established in January, the independent financial audit he had commissioned in March without consulting her, the 2 consecutive board dinners to which she had not been invited, and which she had discovered only through the expense reports. She had seen it coming. She had prepared for it. What stayed with her was Daniel's face, his eyes fixed on the middle distance, on the grain of the mahogany table, on nothing at all. Daniel, who had been her CFO for 6 years. Daniel, who had once called her at midnight from a conference in Zurich, panicking about a regulatory filing deadline, and whom she had walked through the entire document over the phone for 2 hours because she had memorized the compliance requirements in 3 jurisdictions. Daniel, who had held the champagne glass and smiled on the night they closed the Series C round and said, in a voice that she had believed then and chose not to think about now, "We built this, Viv. We actually built this." His eyes did not move from the table. Vivian looked at him for exactly 3 seconds. Then she looked back at Marcus. She said, "What are the terms?" Not a question either. Marcus told her. A severance package of 14 months base salary, a non-disparagement agreement, a transition period of 30 days during which she would remain in an advisory capacity, with access to the office and her assistant, but without executive authority. Standard confidentiality provisions. He said the paperwork would be sent to her by end of day. She said, "Send it to my lawyer." She collected her portfolio and her notebook and her pen. She stood up. She looked at the painting on the far wall, the seascape, gray and muted gold, for the last time from this side of the table. And she felt something that she would later, in her private accounting of events, describe not as grief or rage, but as a kind of cold clarification, a narrowing, the way a lens adjusts to bring a distant object into sharp focus. She said, "Good morning, Marcus," which was a thing people said at the beginning of meetings. And she walked out of the boardroom and down the corridor and into the elevator and out of the building, and she did not look back. She did not cry until she was in the car. And even then, it lasted 47 seconds. She counted. Vivian Kale had built Kale Group from a consulting firm with 3 employees and a leased desk in a shared workspace into a mid-market technology solutions company with a valuation of $340 million, 412 full-time employees, offices in Chicago, New York, and London, and a client roster that included 11 Fortune 500 companies. She had done this over 9 years. She had done it through 2 recessions, a global pandemic, 3 significant pivots in the company's service offering, and the constant low-grade friction of being a woman building a technology company in a room that had been designed over many decades for a different kind of person. She had given the company her name. This was either the proudest or the stupidest thing she had ever done, and on the drive back to her apartment, she had not yet determined which. She spent the first evening at her dining table with a yellow legal pad, a glass of water she did not drink, and the specific quality of silence that comes after something has ended. She did not call anyone. She did not open her laptop. She wrote 2 columns on the legal pad, what she had and what they thought she had. These were not the same list. She had founded the company, which meant she had been present for every decision that had ever shaped it. She knew where everybody was buried, a phrase she used metaphorically, mostly. She knew which vendor contracts had side agreements that existed only in email threads. She knew about the Nevada subsidiary that Daniel had established in 2021 for reasons that had been presented to her as tax efficiency and which she had filed away in a specific compartment of her memory because they had not felt entirely clean at the time. She knew the details of every client relationship, including the 3 that were carried almost entirely by her personal relationships with the client's CEOs and which would not survive a change in leadership without significant maintenance. She also knew, and this was the item she wrote first on the legal pad, before anything else, in the careful print she reserved for things she needed to remember precisely. She also knew about the IP. The intellectual property situation at Kale Group was, thanks to a series of decisions Vivian had made very deliberately in the company's early years, not entirely what the board believed it to be. When she had incorporated the company, she had structured the ownership of the core methodology, the framework that underpinned Kale Group's flagship consulting product, the systems audit approach that every client engagement was built around, through a separate entity, a holding company, Kale IP Holdings LLC, registered in Delaware, wholly owned by Vivian personally. The license agreement between Kale IP Holdings and Kale Group had been drafted in 2016 by her attorney, a woman named Patricia Osei, who specialized in intellectual property and corporate structure, and it had been reviewed and signed by the original board without, Vivian had always suspected, being read with full attention. The license was annual, renewable on January 1st of each year, at the licensor's discretion. The board had 6 weeks before the next renewal date. Vivian looked at what she had written on the legal pad. She looked at the ceiling. She looked at the legal pad again. Then she picked up her phone and called Patricia. Patricia answered on the second ring. She was a calm woman, unhurried in her speech, with the quality of a person who had seen enough corporate disasters to approach each new one with professional equanimity rather than alarm. Vivian said, "I need 30 minutes tomorrow morning. Can you do 8?" Patricia said, "I can do 7:30. Bring the incorporation documents." Vivian said, "I have them." She had always had them. She kept a complete set of the company's foundational documents in a fireproof safe in her home office, not because she had anticipated this specific event, but because she was the kind of person who kept things. Documents, contracts, emails, the specific details of conversations that other people assumed were forgettable. She had a memory that operated like a filing system. Not photographic, but structural. She remembered the architecture of things, the way pieces fit together, the load-bearing walls, the joints where the structure was most likely to fail. She had been building the architecture of what came next since, if she was honest with herself, the board dinner she hadn't been invited to in February. She had just needed the official confirmation to begin. The next 3 days were administrative. She did not go into the office. She had a brief call with her assistant, Yolanda, who was 28 years old and had been with Vivian for 4 years, and who said, in a voice carefully controlled, "I want you to know I'm not sure what's happening yet," which Vivian understood to mean, "I don't know whether to stay or go, and I don't know which decision you want me to make." She said, "Stay through the transition, keep documenting everything, and Yolanda, I need you to make sure my personal files are completely separated from company property before the IT department does any kind of audit. Everything in the shared drive that has my name in the file name, anything that belongs to the personal folder I marked with the green tag. Do you remember the green tag?" Yolanda said, "The one you said was personal research." "Yes. Make sure that folder is gone from the company server before Friday." There was a pause. Then Yolanda said, "Of course." Vivian spent the next day reviewing the license agreement with Patricia. They went through it clause by clause, sitting at the long table in Patricia's office on Michigan Avenue, with the lake visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows in the color of pewter that it turned in late October. Patricia had a yellow highlighter and made precise, minimal marks on the document. When they finished, Patricia set down the highlighter and aligned it with the edge of the document and said, "The renewal clause is unambiguous. As licensor, you have sole discretion. They cannot compel renewal." Vivian said, "What are the notice requirements?" Patricia said, 60 days written notice of non-renewal, but the license term runs through December 31st. Today is October 14th. You have until November 1st to provide notice if you want the license to terminate at year end. Vivian said, "What happens to the company if the license terminates?" Patricia looked at her over the rim of her reading glasses. She was 62 years old and had the particular patience of someone who had spent decades watching people ask questions they already knew the answers to. She said, "Without the license, they cannot legally use the methodology. Every active client engagement built on the framework would need to be restructured or renegotiated. They would be in breach of their current client contracts, which reference the methodology by name in their service agreements." Vivian said, "And the valuation?" Patricia said, "The methodology is the primary asset that underpins the company's valuation. Without it, the company's market value drops significantly. In the current environment, I would estimate between 30 and 40%. Vivian said nothing for a moment. She looked at the lake. Then she said, "I'm not going to terminate the license." Patricia waited. Vivian said, "I'm going to let it renew. Once." Patricia said, "Once. I want them to believe they've neutralized the issue. I want them comfortable. And then I want to be in a position to acquire a controlling equity stake in the company at the reduced valuation that will follow DeRavos's tenure." Patricia looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Walk me through the timeline you're envisioning." Vivian walked her through the timeline. It took 40 minutes. When she finished, Patricia looked at the document on the table and then at Vivian and said, "This is well constructed. You've thought about this for a while." Vivian said, "Yes." Patricia said, "You understand it requires patience." Vivian said, "Yes." Patricia said, "All right, then I'll start drafting the renewal notice. And Vivian, I think you should also retain a financial forensics firm. If there's anything in the Nevada subsidiary that doesn't hold up under examination, you want to know about it before they do." Vivian said, "I already have a name. I'll send it to you." She left Patricia's office and walked the 2 blocks to the parking garage in the sharp October cold, the wind off the lake pressing against the front of her coat. And she stood at the elevator and thought about Daniel Cho and the Nevada subsidiary and the way he had not looked at her during Marcus's speech. And she felt the cold clarification again, that narrowing of focus, that adjustment of the lens. And she got into her car and drove home. DeRavos arrived at Kale Group on October 28th. Vivian knew this because Yolanda texted her a single word at 9:04 a.m. Here. She had never met DeRavos. She had looked her up, naturally, in the 3 days following the board meeting, had reviewed her LinkedIn, her professional history, the 2 industry profiles that had been written about her, a presentation she had given at a fintech conference in 2022 that was available on YouTube. She was, on the basis of this research, competent, not exceptional. The companies she had led or contributed to had performed adequately, within expected ranges, without any particular distinction, but competent. She was good-looking in the specific way of someone who understood how to deploy their appearance in professional contexts. Polished, deliberate, calibrated to project confidence without ostentation. She had a master's degree from Northwestern and a way of speaking in interviews that was fluent and assured, and said, when examined closely, very little of substance. Vivian had watched the conference presentation twice and made one note on her legal pad: thin on operations. Kale Group's primary complexity was operational. The company's value proposition was built on implementation, not just advice, but execution. The ability to actually deploy the methodology inside a client's organization and produce measurable results. This required an intimate understanding of how the product worked, why it worked, and what happened when it encountered the specific resistances and edge cases that arose in real organizational environments. It required the kind of knowledge that was not transferable by briefing document. It required what Vivian had spent 9 years building, and which no one had thought to ask her to document before they walked her out. She had not offered to document it. She had completed her 30-day transition period by appearing in the office on exactly 6 of the 30 days, conducting 3 meetings with the department heads, answering the specific questions she was asked, and no others, and signing the paperwork her lawyer had reviewed and returned with 17 modifications, 14 of which the board accepted, and 3 of which they did not, and which her lawyer told her to let go because they were not the critical items. The critical item was a clause her lawyer had inserted regarding her ongoing ownership rights to any work product derived from or incorporating the licensed methodology. The board's attorneys had reviewed it, flagged it as standard IP protection language, and approved it. This was correct. It was standard. It was also, given what Vivienne intended, the single most important sentence in the document. She returned her keycard on November 29th, a Tuesday, and walked out of the building for the last time as an employee, and she drove to a diner 3 blocks away and ordered a cup of coffee and sat in a corner booth and allowed herself 30 minutes to feel whatever she needed to feel. She ordered a second cup of coffee. She drank it. She left a good tip. Then she drove to her attorney's office and they reviewed the final version of the non-disclosure agreement together, and Vivienne signed her name in the careful, minimal signature she had used on every document for the past 20 years. And she said, "Let's talk about the next step." The next step was the Nevada subsidiary. The financial forensics firm she had retained was run by a woman named Sandra Kipling, who had spent 12 years at the SEC before going private, and who had, in Vivienne's estimation, the best combination of technical skill and discretion that money could buy. She was not inexpensive. She was worth it. Sandra's preliminary review of the Nevada subsidiary, Kale Group Western Holdings LLC, established in March of 2021, took 11 days. She presented her findings in a 23-page report delivered on a Tuesday morning, sitting in Vivienne's home office with a cup of tea she had barely touched, wearing a gray blazer and the expression of someone delivering medical results that were not catastrophic but were not clean. The subsidiary had been used to process a series of consulting agreements with 3 clients who were listed in the entity's filings but not in Kale Group's primary client roster. The revenue from these agreements, totaling across 18 months of activity, approximately $4.2 million, had been reported at the subsidiary level, but not fully consolidated in the parent company's financial statements. This was not, Sandra explained, necessarily illegal. There were structures under which this kind of arrangement could be legitimate, but the structure as it existed was, in her professional opinion, aggressively positioned, which was her phrase for arrangements that would survive regulatory scrutiny only if scrutinized by someone who was not paying close attention. Vivienne said, "Were any of these agreements signed by me?" Sandra said, "No. All 3 were signed by Daniel Cho in his capacity as CFO." Vivienne said, "And if the SEC were to examine these agreements?" Sandra said, "They would have questions, significant ones. I want to be clear. I am not in a position to characterize this as fraud without further investigation. What I can tell you is that the structure is unusual and that the failure to consolidate the revenue is difficult to explain under standard accounting principles." Vivienne said, "Is it the kind of thing that would require the company to restate its financials if it came to light?" Sandra Shaw considered this. She said, "Potentially, yes, depending on the extent of the discrepancy and how regulators interpreted the intent." Vivienne said, "And a restatement would affect the valuation." Sandra said, "A restatement would affect the valuation significantly. It would also likely result in personal liability for the signatory." For Daniel. Vivienne looked at the report on her desk for a moment. She thought about the board dinner in February. She thought about Daniel's eyes fixed on the table while Marcus spoke. She thought about the client relationship she had personally managed for 6 years with a healthcare company in Boston, the CEO of which had called her twice in the week since her departure, calls she had not yet returned. She said, "Sandra, I need you to compile a complete regulatory filing package, everything that would be required to bring this to the SEC's attention. I want it complete and ready." Sandra said, "You want it ready but not filed?" Vivienne said, "Not yet." Sandra nodded slowly. She said, "Understood. And you should know, if this does go to the SEC, the investigation timeline is typically 18 to 24 months. The company would be under a cloud for that entire period." Vivienne said, "I know." She did not file it. Not yet. She set it aside in the same careful compartment where she kept the IP license, the client relationships, the specific operational knowledge that existed nowhere in Kale Group's documentation because it had always lived only in her head. She was building a collection, she was assembling the pieces into an architecture. She was patient, she had always been patient. It was the quality about her that people who did not know her well tended to misread as passivity, and it was the quality that people who knew her well understood was the opposite, was, in fact, the most dangerous thing about her. Dara Voss, in the first 3 weeks of her tenure, did exactly what Vivian had expected. Yolanda, who had stayed, sent brief weekly text messages that read less like gossip and more like field reports, delivered in the factual, unembellished style that Vivian had trained her in, and which she now found herself grateful for. Week 1, Dara had conducted back-to-back meetings with every department head. She had presented a strategic vision deck at an all-hands meeting on Friday afternoon. The deck had been heavy on language about innovation and agile transformation, and lighter on specific operational plans. She had announced the formation of 3 new internal committees, the purposes of which were not entirely clear. Week 2, Dara had restructured the weekly executive meeting to include a standing agenda item called Culture Pulse, which was 20 minutes dedicated to discussing employee sentiment. 2 of the department heads had privately complained to Yolanda about the loss of operational review time this represented. Dara had also begun a process of restructuring the client servicing teams, moving people between accounts in ways that, according to Yolanda's careful phrasing, some clients had noted. Week 3, the Boston client, the healthcare company whose CEO had called Vivian twice, had formally requested a call with the leadership team to discuss the ongoing transition. Yolanda had been copied on the calendar invitation in her administrative capacity and had forwarded it to Vivian without comment. Vivian had looked at the calendar invitation for a long time. Then she had called the client's CEO, a man named Robert Firth, for the first time since her departure. Robert Firth was 68 years old and had been a client of hers for 5 years, and spoke to her in the manner of someone who had arrived, through their professional relationship, at a genuine mutual respect. He said, "Vivian, I've been waiting for your call." She said, "I know. I apologize for the delay." He said, "Tell me what's happening over there." She said, "There's been a leadership transition. I suspect you know that." He said, "I know that. What I don't know is what it means for our engagement." She said, "I think that depends on what you decide." There was a pause. Then he said, "Our contract comes up for renewal in February." She said, "I know." He said, "Is there a version of this where we follow you rather than the company?" She said, "I'm not in a position to solicit that conversation right now." Which was true. The non-solicitation clause in her separation agreement prohibited her from approaching current clients for 12 months. She had not approached Robert Firth. He had called her. The distinction was meaningful. He said, "I'm not asking you to solicit me, Vivian. I'm asking whether there's a version of this." She said, "I think we should wait for February, Robert, and I think you should take that call with the new leadership team and make an informed assessment of what you see." There was another pause. Then Robert said, "All right, I can do that." And then, "Vivian, for what it's worth, whatever happened over there, they made a mistake." She said, "Thank you, Robert." She hung up and sat very still for a moment, and then she picked up her pen and wrote Robert Firth's name on the legal pad next to a column she had labeled, in her careful print, February. The 6-week mark fell on December 9th. Vivian had been tracking it. Not obsessively, she had spent the 6 weeks constructively, working with Patricia on the corporate structure of the new entity she was building, reviewing Sandra's forensic package, running quiet calculations about valuation and timing, and the specific conditions that would need to be in place for the acquisition she was planning to be viable. She had been working, she had been focused, but she had also been watching. The first indication that the board's comfortable assumption that replacing Vivian would be, in the structural sense, a simple personnel swap was incorrect came in the 4th week of Dara's tenure, when the company's largest client, a logistics firm in Dallas that represented approximately 18% of annual recurring revenue, requested an urgent review meeting. The logistics client had been managed for 4 years through a combination of Vivian's quarterly executive check-ins and a client team whose institutional knowledge of the account was substantial, but whose ability to navigate the relationship without her direct involvement had never been tested. Yolanda reported that the urgent review meeting had been handled by Dara, who had flown to Dallas with 2 members of the client team, and that the meeting had lasted 3 hours. And that at the end of it, the logistics client had sent an email to the account manager copied to the general inbox that contained the phrase, "We have some significant concerns about the continuity of our engagement." Vivian read that email. Yolanda had forwarded it, technically in her administrative capacity, to Vivian's personal address, which was not strictly part of her role, but which Vivian had not asked her to stop doing. And she noted the specific phrase, "Continuity of engagement." In client relationship language, this meant, "We are thinking about leaving." Week 5 brought the announcement, via a company-wide email from Dara, of a restructuring of the billing model for existing client contracts. The new model moved certain service categories from a retainer structure to a per-project fee structure. This was the kind of decision that could, in theory, increase revenue flexibility, but which required extremely careful communication with existing clients because it represented a change to the financial terms they had budgeted around. Vivian had over the years evaluated and rejected this exact restructuring twice, on both occasions, because the client feedback she had gathered indicated that predictable retainer costs were a primary factor in clients' preference for Kale Group over competitors. She had not documented this analysis anywhere because it had been in her head. Dara did not know it existed. By the time the 6-week mark arrived, Vivian had been told by 3 separate people, Yolanda, a former colleague who still worked in the industry, and a client who had reached out to her directly, that the mood inside Kale Group was something between nervous and openly distressed. The restructuring announcement had generated significant internal resistance. The client-facing teams were fielding an unusual volume of calls from clients asking about the billing changes. The logistics client in Dallas had requested a formal contract review, which was a step removed from an exit conversation, and the 3 new committees Dara had created in week 1 had produced, in 5 weeks, no discernible output. On December 9th, a Friday at 4:47 p.m., Vivian's phone rang. The number was Marcus Webb's personal cell. She let it ring. He called again at 5:12 p.m. She let it ring again. He called a third time at 5:34, and this time she answered because she had decided at some point during the second call that she had let it ring long enough. She said, "Marcus." He said, "Vivian." And then, without preamble, in the tone of a man who had spent the last hour composing a sentence and still hadn't found the right one, "I think we need to talk." She said, "All right." He said, "Are you available Monday?" She said, "I have time at noon." He said, "I'll come to you." She noted that. He would come to her, she said, "My attorney will be present." A pause, then, "Of course." She hung up. She set the phone down on the table. She looked at the legal pad with its columns and its lists and its architecture of pieces assembled over 7 weeks of patient cold work. She looked at it for a long time. Then she went to make coffee, real coffee, the kind she made in the small French press she kept on the kitchen counter, measuring the grounds with the precision of someone for whom the ritual was a form of focus. 2 tablespoons just below boiling water, 4 minutes. She poured it into a white mug and stood at the kitchen counter and drank it, and thought about the meeting on Monday. She thought about what Marcus was going to offer. He was going to offer to bring her back. That was the shape of it. The 6-week disaster had clarified, for the board, that they had underestimated the degree to which the company's stability depended on Vivian's specific knowledge and relationships. They had performed the intellectual exercise of separating the CEO from the company and discovered that the CEO was, in ways they had not adequately accounted for, structurally embedded in the company's operational capacity. They needed her back, or they needed her cooperation, or they needed something from her that they were now in a weakened enough position to ask for rather than demand. What she was going to offer in return was a different question. She finished the coffee. She washed the mug. She went to her desk and picked up her phone and called Patricia. Patricia answered on the second ring. Vivian said, "Monday at noon, Marcus Webb is coming here." Patricia said, "I heard he's been trying to reach you." Vivian said, "He'll offer reinstatement, probably, or a consultancy, something that reestablishes their access to me without acknowledging that the original decision was a mistake." Patricia said, "What do you want from the meeting?" Vivian said, "Information. I want to know how bad it actually is. And I want them to make me an offer before I say anything about the IP, the forensic review, or the client conversations. Patricia said, "You're not going to use the IP license as a threat." Vivian said, "I'm not going to use it as a threat. I'm going to use it as a condition." Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Acquisition terms." Vivian said, "Yes." Another pause. Patricia said, "You want to buy them back?" Vivian said, "I want to buy them at the price they'll be worth if this continues for another 6 weeks, and the Dallas client leaves and the billing restructuring generates a significant churn number, and the Q4 numbers reflect all of that." Patricia said, "Which is significantly below current valuation." Vivian said, "Which is why the timing matters. I need them desperate enough to accept terms, but not so collapsed that there's nothing left to acquire." Patricia made a sound that was not quite a laugh. It was closer to the sound of professional appreciation, the specific sound of a lawyer who had spent 4 decades watching people make decisions and was now watching someone make a very precise one. She said, "I'll be there Monday at 11:30. Vivian said, "Thank you." She set the phone down and sat at her desk in the quiet of the apartment and thought, for a moment, not about the meeting or the strategy or the architecture, but about the specific weight of something being built back from its own rubble. About what it cost, not financially. She knew the financial cost, had calculated it to the decimal. She meant the other cost, the one that didn't appear on any spreadsheet. The cost of being the kind of person who could sit in a boardroom and hear her own name used in the past tense, and then drive home and count the seconds of her own crying and pick up a legal pad and begin. She thought about that cost for approximately 3 minutes. Then she opened her laptop and began reviewing the Q3 financial model she had reconstructed from memory, checking her estimates of the revenue impact that would be visible in Q4 if the Dallas client formalized its exit. The numbers were, if anything, slightly worse than she had initially projected. She adjusted the model. Monday arrived gray and cold, a Chicago December with a sky the color of unpolished silver, and a wind that came off the lake with the specific hostility of something that had been traveling a long way to arrive. Vivian was dressed when Patricia arrived at 11:30. Dark trousers, a charcoal cashmere sweater, the kind of clothes that said nothing and communicated everything. She had her legal pad and a second pad for Patricia, and 2 pens and a glass of water at each position around her dining table, which she had repurposed as a conference table for the meeting. Patricia came in, removed her coat, sat down, reviewed her notes for 15 minutes. At 5 minutes to 12, the intercom buzzed. Vivian pressed the button and said, "Yes." The doorman said, "A Mr. Webb is here, Ms. Kale." She said, "Send him up." Marcus arrived alone, which surprised her slightly. She had expected him to bring an attorney. His decision not to suggested either confidence or haste, and looking at him when he came through the door, the navy suit, the mild smile, the deliberate movements, she concluded it was haste wearing the mask of confidence. She offered him coffee. He declined. She gestured to the chair across from hers, and he sat. And the 3 of them arranged themselves around the dining table in the configuration of people who are about to negotiate something important. And for a moment the apartment was very quiet, except for the low register of traffic from the street below and the hiss of the radiator in the corner. Marcus said, "Vivian, I appreciate you seeing me." She said, "Of course." He said, "I'll be direct," which people always said before being indirect. The board has been reviewing the transition, and we believe there are some gaps in the process that we should address. We moved quickly, and in moving quickly, we perhaps didn't give adequate weight to some of the transition considerations that have become apparent. Vivian said, "What considerations are those?" He looked at Patricia briefly, then back at Vivian. He said, "Client relationships, the depth of the operational knowledge that you held specifically. We've encountered some challenges in the last several weeks that have made clear that the transition plan was not as comprehensive as we believed at the time." Vivian said, "Yes." He waited. When she added nothing, he said, "We would like to explore whether there is a structure under which you would be willing to contribute to stabilizing the company during this period. A consultancy arrangement or—" Vivian said, "Marcus, I don't want a consultancy arrangement." He stopped. She said, "I want to discuss acquisition terms. In the silence that followed, she watched his face perform the specific sequence of adjustments that she associated with intelligent people encountering information they had not prepared for. The mild smile holding, then recalibrating, the eyes sharpening slightly, the body language shifting from the forward lean of someone making an offer to the more careful stillness of someone reevaluating the room. He said, "Acquisition." She said, "I want to acquire a controlling equity stake in Kale Group. I want to return to the company as CEO with full executive authority and board restructuring rights, and I want those terms finalized before January 1st. He said, "Vivian, the company is currently valued at," she said. "I know what the company is currently valued at. I also know what it will be valued at after Q4 results are filed, which will reflect the current client retention situation, and I know what it will be valued at in the event that certain financial matters related to the Nevada subsidiary require regulatory attention." The silence this time was a different quality. Marcus's face went through a sequence of adjustments that was shorter and more controlled than the last, but contained, at its core, a moment of very clear alarm that he shuddered quickly. His hands, which had been loose on the table, became still in a particular way. He said slowly, "I'm not sure what you're referring to." Vivian said, "I think you are, and I want you to understand that I'm not making a threat. I'm making a commercial offer. The structure I'm proposing is straightforward. I will make a private equity purchase of a controlling stake at a price that reflects the company's true value in its current state, which is meaningfully below the nominal valuation. And in exchange, the existing board members will reduce their representation to a minority position. Daniel Cho's position will be subject to a separate review process, and Daravos's contract will be terminated. The IP license, which comes up for renewal on January 1st, will be renewed as part of the acquisition structure and brought in-house permanently." Marcus said, "The IP license." Patricia, who had not spoken, said, "Kale IP Holdings LLC, registered in Delaware, currently holds an exclusive annual license for the methodology that underpins the company's primary consulting product. The license is renewable at the licensor's sole discretion. Ms. Kale is the sole owner of the licensor entity." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the table, then at Patricia, then at Vivian. Something had changed in his expression. The mild smile was gone. In its place was something that Vivian recognized as the face of a man recalculating the architecture of his position. He said, when was this license structure established?" Vivian said, "At incorporation, 2015. It was reviewed and signed by the original board." He said, "And you never," she said, "I never needed to use it before. There was never a reason to." He was quiet again. Then he said, "I need to take this to the board." She said, "Of course, take the weekend. I want a response by Wednesday." He said, "That's a very short," she said, "Wednesday, Marcus." He stood up. He picked up his jacket. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, an expression that contained, underneath its professional composure, something that was almost respect and almost something else. Something older and less comfortable. He said, "Vivian." She said, "Good luck with the weekend." He left. Patricia waited until the door closed, and then she sat back in her chair and said, "He didn't know about the IP structure." Vivian said, "No." Patricia said, "None of them did." Vivian said, "No." Patricia said, "You kept it quiet for 9 years." Vivian said, "I kept it quiet because I hoped I would never need it, and then because I knew I would." Patricia looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "I'll prepare the term sheet." Vivian said, "Make it clean. I don't want it to look punitive. I want it to look like an ordinary commercial transaction." Patricia said, "It will look like what it is." Vivian said, "Good." The board met on Tuesday. Vivian was not there, which was different from the other times the board had met without her, different in the specific sense that previously she had not been there because she had not been invited, and now she was not there because she had not needed to be. She spent Tuesday at her desk, reviewing the term sheet Patricia had sent over, working through a projected 12-month operating plan for the company under her reassumed leadership, running the numbers on the client retention scenarios. She called Sandra Kipling in the afternoon and told her that the Nevada subsidiary matter was on hold pending the board's response, and that Sandra should prepare a summary of remediation options in the event that the acquisition went through and the situation needed to be resolved internally rather than externally. Sandra said, "You want to clean it up yourself, not report it." Vivian said, "I want the option. If Daniel cooperates with a restructured arrangement, there may be a version of this that doesn't require regulatory intervention." Sandra said, "And if he doesn't cooperate?" Vivian said, "Then we file." She ate dinner at her kitchen table with a book she couldn't focus on and a glass of water. She went to bed at 10. She slept adequately. Wednesday arrived. At 9:17 a.m., Marcus Webb called. She answered on the third ring. She said, "Marcus?" He said, "The board met yesterday. We've reviewed your proposal." She waited. He said, "There are elements we'd like to negotiate. The stake percentage and the board composition question." She said, "The stake is non-negotiable. 55% minimum. The board composition reflects the equity split. Those are the structural terms." He said, "Vivian, the existing investors," she said, "have a minority position under my proposal, which is significantly better than the position they'll have if Q4 results come in at the number I'm projecting, which they will, and if the company then also faces a license non-renewal situation on January 1st, which is 12 days away." A long pause. He said, "What about Dara?" Vivian said, "Dara's contract is terminated with a standard severance package. 6 months. She should consult her own attorney about the terms." Another pause. Then Marcus said, "Danielle?" Vivian said, "Daniel remains in an advisory capacity, with reduced authority, pending an internal financial review. The outcome of that review will determine his longer-term position." She let him understand what that meant without saying it more plainly. He understood. He said, "I need 48 hours. She said, "You have until Thursday at 5. He said, "Vivian." A pause. "For what it's worth, I want you to know that I always believed you were..." She said, "Thursday at 5, Marcus." She hung up. She sat with the phone in her hand for a moment, in the quiet apartment, in the gray December light, and she thought about the word foundational, about the way he had chosen it, so carefully, in that boardroom 9 weeks ago, the past tense of it, the way it was meant to signal completion, a thing that had been important once and was now finished, its usefulness concluded, its contribution acknowledged and set aside. She thought about foundations, about the specific function they served, about what a building looked like when someone tried to remove its foundation from underneath while the structure was still standing. She picked up her pen. She opened to a fresh page of the legal pad. She began drafting the operational priorities she would implement in the first 30 days of her return. The call came Thursday at 4:38 p.m. Marcus accepted her terms. All of them. The acquisition documents were executed over the following 10 days, with Patricia and the board's attorneys working through the mechanics of the equity transfer, the IP restructuring, and the board composition changes. It was, from a legal standpoint, a relatively clean transaction. The complexity was in the details, and Vivian was present for every detail. The IP license was formally brought in-house on December 31st, the day before it would have been due for renewal, incorporated into the acquisition. Structure as a permanent asset transfer from Kale IP Holdings to the company. Vivian's attorney structured the transfer at a valuation that reflected the asset's true strategic worth, which had the effect of significantly increasing the acquisition's paper value and further diluting the existing shareholders' positions. This was not accidental. Dara Voss's termination was processed on December 22nd, a Friday before the Christmas week. Yolanda texted Vivian at 3:44 p.m. with a single line. She left at 3:30. Security escorted her to the lobby. Vivian read the message. She set the phone down. She thought about Dara Voss for a moment, not with pleasure, not with the kind of satisfaction that she had always associated, in other people, with the conclusion of a rivalry. She thought about her with something closer to dispassion. Dara had been a piece in someone else's game. She had not understood the company she was walking into, had not understood the structural dependencies, had not understood that the methodology she was being handed was not actually owned by the company that was paying her salary. She had failed quickly and visibly in the way that people failed when they were given a job whose requirements they could not fully see. Vivian did not think of her as an enemy. She thought of her as a symptom. The enemies were the board, were Marcus, with his deliberate adjustments of the chair and his carefully chosen past tense, were Elliot Bryce, who had introduced Dara to the board and whose motivations she had not fully mapped but would, were Danya Yul, who had not looked at her. The financial review of the Nevada subsidiary was initiated internally on January 8th, the second week of Vivian's reinstated leadership. She appointed Sandra Kipling to lead the review in an external consulting capacity, with full access to the company's financial records and the authority to interview relevant personnel. She told Daniel about the review in a 10-minute meeting. In her office, sitting across the desk from him, looking at him directly in the way that he had not looked at her in the boardroom 11 weeks ago. She told him the scope of the review. She told him the timeline. She told him that the review would be conducted with full independence and that she would not be providing direction to Sandra about its conclusions. Then she said, "I want to give you the opportunity to consult with your own counsel before the review begins. I'd recommend you do that today." Daniel looked at her. For the first time since the boardroom, he looked at her directly, and his face had the specific quality of a person who had been moving quickly in a particular direction and had arrived without warning at a wall. He said, "Vivian?" She said, "Yes." He said, I need you to know that when they came to me, when Marcus first..." She said, "Daniel, I'm not asking for an explanation right now. I'm telling you that a formal financial review will begin on January 8th, and that I'd recommend you speak with your attorney today. That's the professional courtesy I'm extending to you." He was quiet for a long moment. His hands were on the desk, and she looked at them. The hands that had not signed anything she had signed, the hands that had signed other things. And she felt the cold clarification one more time. That lens adjusting, that precise narrowing. Then he said, "All right." She said, "You can go." He went. The review took 6 weeks. Sandra's final report was delivered on February 19th, and it was thorough and careful and unambiguous in its conclusions. The Nevada subsidiary had been used to process agreements that constituted, in Sandra's professional assessment, a material misstatement of Kale Group's consolidated financials over an 18-month period. The revenue had not been fraudulently diverted. It had been reported, just incorrectly, just in a structure that obscured it from the consolidated picture in ways that appeared intentional. Vivian read the report and sent it to her attorney and asked for an assessment of the disclosure obligations under SEC rules for public company adjacent entities. Patricia's assessment came back the same day. Disclosure was required, not optional. She called Daniel's attorney, with whom she had been in communication since January, and she provided the timeline for the disclosure filing and the company's cooperation with the anticipated SEC inquiry. She said that the company's position would be that the misstatement had been identified through an internal review initiated by the new CEO upon her return, that the company was cooperating fully, and that the individual who had signed the subsidiary agreements had resigned from his position effective immediately. Daniel resigned that afternoon. The paperwork had been prepared. She signed it without ceremony. She put it in the folder. She moved on. February brought the client meetings. Robert Firth's contract had come up for renewal, and she flew to Boston on a Tuesday for the first time in 4 months and sat across from him in his conference room. A room with a view of the harbor in the winter gray, the water the same color as the sky in the way that water and sky merged in Chicago on certain mornings. And she said, "I'm back, Robert. Properly back. Tell me what's been difficult." He told her. It took 90 minutes. She listened, took notes, asked questions, and at the end of the 90 minutes she said, "I can fix the billing structure within 60 days. The team composition will be restructured by March 1st, and I want to propose a revised 3-year engagement framework that gives you more flexibility on scope while maintaining the quality guarantees we've always operated under." He said, "Send me the proposal." She sent it that evening from her hotel room. He signed it on Friday. The Dallas client was harder. the logistics firm had moved significantly toward exit in the 6 weeks of Dara's tenure, and Vivian understood that the damage to the relationship was not cosmetic. It was structural, the result of a billing change that had disrupted the client's own internal budgeting, compounded by a shift in the account team that had lost the institutional knowledge of the client's specific operational context. She flew to Dallas on a Thursday. She brought no one with her. She sat in the logistics firm's boardroom, a different boardroom, in a low building in an industrial park, with fluorescent lighting and a slightly sticky table surface, and coffee from a machine in the corridor. And she spent 4 hours with their operations chief and their CFO, going through the engagement history line by line, identifying the specific points of failure in the last 3 months, and proposing a remediation plan that was detailed and specific and that demonstrated, without any ambiguity, that she understood their operation in a way that no one else at Kale Group could. At the end of 4 hours, the operations chief said, "We appreciated you making the trip yourself." She said, "I should have come sooner. I'm sorry for the disruption." He looked at her for a moment and then said, "We'll want to see the revised engagement terms in writing." She said, "You'll have them by Monday?" She flew home Thursday night on the last flight out of Dallas, sitting in a window seat with the city lights spreading below her in the particular geometry of a city built on a flat plane. Not the vertical density of Chicago or New York, but something horizontal and sprawling, a city that had expanded outward rather than upward. And she thought about what it felt like to be returning to work that was hers. Not as an abstraction, as a specific physical sensation. The way a particular kind of cold clarity inhabited the body when the thing it had been denied for a period of time was returned to it. Not joy, not triumph. Something more like a system returning to its operating. Temperature after a period of imposed cooling, something like correct. She opened her laptop on the tray table and began drafting the Dallas proposal and worked on it for the duration of the flight and had it finished when the wheels touched down at O'Hare at 11:40 p.m. The first quarter under her reinstated leadership produced numbers that were, when Patricia reviewed them with her in early April, the confirmation of an architecture she had spent 5 months building. The revenue had stabilized. Client retention was at 91%, which was 2 points below her historical average, but significantly above the trajectory it had been on in December. 3 new client engagements had been initiated through the relationships she had maintained during her absence. The financial restatement process, while disruptive, had been handled with enough speed and transparency that the regulatory inquiry, which was proceeding, as Sandra had predicted, on an 18 to 24-month timeline, was not creating the reputational damage that a slower or less cooperative response might have. The board, restructured under her acquisition terms to a minority position, had held 2 meetings at which she had presented the Q1 numbers. Marcus had attended both. He had been professional, measured, and careful in his questions, in the manner of someone who had recalibrated the terms of their relationship entirely and was still locating the new boundaries. Elliot Bryce had resigned from the board in January, citing strategic differences, which was the corporate language for a man who understood that his position had become untenable and preferred to leave before he was asked. Vivian had accepted his resignation with 2 sentences. "The board thanks you for your contributions. The company wishes you well in your future endeavors." She had written both sentences herself. On a Thursday afternoon in late April, Vivian sat in her office. Her office returned to its original configuration, the painting back on the wall, her name on the door in the small, tasteful type that the building's directory used, and she reviewed the termy sheet for the Dallas client's renewed 3-year engagement, which had come back signed and with a note attached that said, in the operations chief's unadorned handwriting, "Good to be back to normal." She initialed the term sheet and set it in the outgoing folder. She looked at the window for a moment. The Chicago spring was beginning its tentative arrival, the way spring always arrived here. Not with any particular confidence, but with a kind of stubborn insistence, pushing up through the cold in the patches of green that appeared in the parks and along the lakeshore, the sky lightening by increments too small to notice on any individual day, but visible in aggregate. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. The message was from Yolanda. "Sandra Kipling on line 2. She picked up the phone. Sandra said, "The SEC has scheduled their first formal interview. They want Daniel on March 4th. Vivian said, "Is his attorney aware?" Sandra said, "As of this morning, yes." Vivian said, "Keep me informed." She set the phone down. She opened the next document in her stack, a proposal from the technology team for an updated version of the methodology framework, the first significant revision to the core product in 4 years, which she had commissioned in February as part of the operational renewal plan. She read it carefully, making notes in the margins in her careful print, flagging the sections that needed further development and the sections that were already strong. She had been thinking about the revision for 2 years before the board had removed her. She had not had time to initiate it then. She had time now. She turned the page and kept reading. The SEC inquiry into the Nevada subsidiary concluded 17 months after the initial disclosure with a formal finding of misstatement and a settlement that required Kale Group to pay a civil penalty and implement enhanced financial controls. Daniel Cho, in a separate proceeding, entered a settlement agreement that included personal financial penalties and a 5-year bar from serving as an officer or director of a public company. Vivian read the settlement terms when they were filed and noted, with the equanimity she had cultivated over the preceding months, that they were consistent with what Sandra had projected from the beginning. She forwarded the filing to Patricia with a brief note. "For the record." Patricia wrote back, "For the record." The methodology revision launched in September of the following year to 8 existing clients and 4 new ones who had been selected specifically because their operational contexts would generate the most useful data for the product's evolution. 3 of the 8 existing clients expanded their engagement scope in the first 90 days. The 4th sent a note that said, "In the CEO's characteristic directness, this is better than the old version, considerably." Vivian kept the note. She kept most notes. She had a drawer in her desk, the bottom left, the deepest one, where she kept the things that mattered in the specific, unquantifiable sense. The signed letter from her first client, written on paper with a letterhead that she had helped design, the photograph of the original 3-person team in the shared workspace, taken the day they signed their first significant contract, a printed email from a client's employee, not the CEO, just an employee, someone whose name she barely remembered, that said, "The work your team did here changed how we do things. I thought you should know." She did not keep it because she was sentimental. She kept it because it was evidence of what the work was actually for. Because on the days when the architecture felt heavy, when the patience required to move pieces precisely across a long timeline felt like a cost she was still calculating, she needed to know what was on the other side of the accounting. She did not put the Dallas operations chief's note in the drawer. She set it in a new folder she had labeled, without irony, February. The folder was getting full. The annual board meeting in October, 2 years after the ouster, was the first one at which Vivian presented as the controlling shareholder rather than simply as CEO. The distinction was meaningful to her in a specific way that she had not fully anticipated. Not because the power was new, but because the documentation of it was. Because sitting at the head of the table and looking at the faces around it, she understood that the architecture she had built was no longer provisional. It was structural. It was load-bearing. Marcus Webb sat at his reduced position, 2 seats from the end of the table. He was still the same Marcus Webb, the navy suit, the measured manner, the deliberate quality of his presence. But something had shifted in the geometry of the room, and she could see him feel it. Could see the recalibration in the specific way he held his pen, the slight adjustment of his posture, the careful framing of his questions. He asked a thorough and reasonable set of questions about the Q3 numbers. She answered them with full precision and transparency. She told him what had worked and what had not, what she intended to change in Q4, where she was uncertain, and what her contingency plan was. She ran the meeting the way she had always run meetings, with the information fully present and nothing concealed. After the meeting, as the board members were collecting their papers, Marcus stopped at the door and said, "Vivian?" She looked up. He said, "The presentation was excellent, as always." She said, "Thank you, Marcus." He said, "For what it's worth." And then he stopped. He seemed to decide against whatever he had been about to say. He nodded once and walked out. Yolanda, who had been taking notes at the end of the table, looked up from her pad and met Vivian's eyes with the brief, clean exchange of understanding that had developed between them over the years. Not friendship exactly, or not only friendship, but the specific understanding between two people who had been through the same rooms in the same building at the same time and had not forgotten what they had seen. Vivian said, "Can you pull the October calendar? I want to look at the Q4 client schedule." Yolanda said, "Of course." She opened her laptop. Vivian turned back to her notebook and wrote the first item on the Q4 list: Dallas, Expansion Scope Review. She clicked her pen once. She began.